This story was sent to me by one of my subscribers named Emily Rhodes, and I wanted to share it on the channel. I'm 26 years old, and this year I finally bought a house after living with roommates for nearly 8 years. Seclusion is something I truly value, so owning a place of my own felt like a huge achievement. The house was located in a small town about 2 hours away from where I used to live. The town itself was much smaller, with fewer buildings and a quieter atmosphere. It wasn't completely rural, but the homes were spaced far apart, separated by open fields and clusters of trees. The house I purchased was modest and on the more affordable side of the market. It sat deep within a forest, a few miles away from the town's center. On the day I moved in, I hadn't met a single person. No neighbors, no townsfolk. With trees surrounding the house and blocking nearly every view, it felt as if I had moved into the middle of nowhere. Saying it like that makes it sound eerie, but at the time it just felt lonely, isolated. I had rented a moving van for the day and got straight to work unloading everything. To save time, I piled all the boxes in the living room instead of sorting them right away. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, I made one last trip outside for the remaining boxes. That's when I froze. A man was standing on my porch, nearly blocking the front door. He startled me, and I almost dropped the box I was carrying. After a moment of awkward silence, I managed to ask what he was doing there. The man, who looked to be around 50s, smiled and said he was my new neighbor. I forced a polite smile and told him it was nice to meet him, though something about the encounter felt off. I hadn't seen him walking up the driveway, and since the property was surrounded by dense forest, I had no idea where he could have come from. Without saying much else, the man stared at me for a few seconds before turning around and walking off the porch, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, unsettled. After a minute, I carried the last few boxes inside and checked the windows to make sure he was gone. I didn't see him anywhere. When I finally left to return the van, I half expected to see him walking along the dirt road, but he was nowhere in sight. There weren't any side paths or shortcuts that I knew of, which made it even stranger. Later that night, after taking a taxi back home, I started unpacking slowly. I was exhausted, but wanted to assemble my bed before sleeping. I carried the wooden pieces into the bedroom and began putting them together. That's when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks at the front door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood still, listening. Another knock followed. I crept toward the door and looked through the peephole. It was him, the same man from earlier, but something was wrong. His body was trembling unnaturally, his head twitching in jerky, uneven motions, but his eyes were locked on the doorknob. He stared at it like a predator fixated on prey. "Hey, it's your neighbor. Can you open the door?" I didn't move. I just kept watching. His expression twisted from a smile into frustration, then rage. He pounded the door so hard the wood rattled. Then, suddenly, he stopped. Slowly, he turned his head toward the pitch-black forest beyond the porch. He raised his hand and made a strange waving motion, as if signaling someone out there. Without another word, he ran into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Terrified, I immediately called the police. They arrived later that night but found no trace of him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I never saw that man again. In the months since, I've met my actual neighbors, none of whom resembled the stranger who came to my door. Nobody in town recognized my description of him either. To this day, I still wonder who he was waving to that night, or how many people were watching from the forest, waiting for me to unlock the door. Thank you to Emily Rhodes for sending this terrifying story. If you have a story, send it in and it might be featured next.
This story was sent to me by one of my subscribers named Laura Bennett, and I wanted to share it on the channel. This happened to me 3 years ago when I moved into a small home. It was only a mile from where I'd lived before, so the area wasn't entirely unfamiliar. However, it was on the side of town I rarely visited, the part known for its higher crime rate and bad reputation. At the time, I wasn't in a good financial situation, so I had no choice but to settle for a cheaper place in that neighborhood. On moving day, I didn't see or speak to anyone. I just unloaded the U-Haul and got everything into the house as quickly as I could. The next day, I started unpacking, moving boxes and furniture into their proper rooms. When I began setting up my office, something outside the window caught my attention. There was a man, young, maybe 25, standing in my driveway. He wasn't doing anything, just staring at the house. Then, without hesitation, he stepped into my yard and began peering into my windows from a distance. A wave of discomfort washed over me. I left the window and hurried downstairs, planning to confront him. But when I opened the front door, he was gone. He wasn't in the yard, the driveway, or even walking along the sidewalk. It was as if he had vanished. I waited for a few minutes to see if he'd return, but he never did. I tried to shrug it off and went back to unpacking. Yeah, it was weird, but what was I supposed to do? By the evening, I had most of the house organized. I took a quick break to grab lunch, then worked on the bedroom until around 10 p.m. Exhausted, I decided to call it a night. The house was still cluttered, but I didn't care. I turned off the lights and got into bed. Within minutes, I was asleep. At some point, I woke up and glanced at the clock on the floor. It read 3 a.m. I sighed, rolled over, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it. A faint, muffled sound coming from downstairs. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, clearer this time. Something heavy being dragged across the floor. I sat up, listening intently. After a few seconds, the sound repeated. Slowly, I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door. The moment I did, the noise stopped. The house fell completely silent. I stepped into the hallway and walked toward the staircase, my heart pounding. I crept down a few steps and leaned over the railing, shining my phone's light into the darkness below. Nothing moved. Everything looked still. When I reached the bottom, I turned on the living room light and froze. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Nothing appeared stolen or broken. But then I noticed it. All of the furniture and boxes that had been pushed against the walls were now pulled away, as if someone had been searching behind them. And behind those gaps, I saw something deeply unsettling. Several carved-out holes in the drywall. My blood ran cold. Someone had broken into my home, and they might still be inside. I bolted upstairs, locked my door, and called the police. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, whispering until the officers arrived. The house stayed silent the entire time. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, nothing. When the police searched the place, they found no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no open windows, no footprints. The only evidence were the carved-out holes in the walls. They told me it looked like someone had been searching for something hidden inside the walls, though they had no idea what. To this day, I don't know what that person was looking for or how they got in and out without being seen. Sometimes I think back to that man standing in my driveway, staring at my house. I can't help but wonder if he was the one who broke in that night, and if he ever found whatever he was searching for. Thank you to Laura Bennett for sending this terrifying story. If you have a story, send it in and it might be featured next.
This story was sent to me by one of my subscribers named Ryan Carter, and I wanted to share it on the channel. I was driving down the empty highway, struggling to keep my eyes open. It was well past 1 a.m., and I couldn't help but glance at the GPS every few seconds, hoping the estimated arrival time would somehow drop faster. I'd been driving for 15 straight hours, only stopping for gas and food.
I was moving to a new town for work, a job that ironically had kept me too busy to visit the place beforehand. When I finally reached the exit and pulled into the town I'd soon call home, it was so dark that I could barely make out my surroundings. Still, I saw enough to know it wasn't as nice as where I'd lived before. The buildings looked old, mostly small, locally owned shops. The streets were quiet, and most of the lights were off. My neighborhood wasn't terrible, though. The houses were close together and looked fairly normal. I parked on the side of the road in front of my new house and got out to take a look. From the outside, it looked ordinary, nothing special, but good enough. What mattered was the inside. I walked up the short driveway, pulled out the key I'd been mailed a few days earlier, and slid it into the lock. But when I turned it, there was no click. I pressed on the handle, and the door glided open. It was already unlocked. My stomach tightened. I stepped inside quickly and looked around. The movers had dropped my things off earlier that morning, so I checked to make sure everything was still there. After a quick glance, nothing seemed to be missing. Maybe the movers had just forgotten to lock up, I told myself, but the thought still left me uneasy. To make things worse, none of the lights worked. I knew I still had to set up my electricity account with the local utility company, but I hadn't expected them to cut power completely. I turned on my phone's flashlight and began checking the rooms. The downstairs looked fine. Old, but in decent shape. Then I went upstairs. At the top of the staircase was a long hallway with 5 doors. I opened them one by one, shining my phone light around. The rooms were all small and in rough condition, some with water damage on the ceilings and walls. When I reached the master bedroom, though, I stopped. The room was completely empty, except for a single tarp spread across the floor. It looked dirty, like something used to wrap furniture. But it was strange. Every other item from the move was downstairs. I stepped back, closed the door, and told myself I'd deal with it tomorrow. I was exhausted and didn't want to think about anything else. I went back downstairs, sat on one of the sofa chairs still wrapped in plastic, and closed my eyes for a moment. I don't know if I actually fell asleep, but a loud thud jolted me awake. It came from upstairs, heavy, sharp, and close. My pulse spiked. The house went silent again. I stood frozen at the base of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. After a minute, I pulled out my phone, turned the flashlight back on, and slowly climbed the creaky steps. When I reached the top and aimed the light down the hallway, I froze in terror. The master bedroom door, the one I had closed, was now slightly open. And in the narrow gap between the door and the frame, I could see the outline of a figure. Someone was standing there, motionless, staring directly at me. Panic surged through me. I nearly tripped down the stairs as I turned and bolted. I ran out the front door, down the driveway, and straight into my car. My first instinct was to drive away, but all my belongings were inside. I didn't want to lose everything I owned. I grabbed my phone and called 911. While waiting for the police, I sat in my car on the side of the road, eyes locked on the dark windows of the house. I never saw anyone move inside, and no one came out. When the officers arrived and searched the house, they found the back door wide open. Whoever had been there was gone. They told me someone had likely been living inside the house, probably squatting there since it had been vacant for months. At first, I thought they meant the attic, but there was no attic. They were talking about the master bedroom, which meant that when I opened that door earlier and saw the tarp on the floor, the person was probably already in there, hiding behind the wall or right behind the door. If I had stepped just a little farther into the room that night, there's a real chance I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Thank you to Ryan Carter for sending this chilling story. If you have a story, send it in and it might be featured next.